Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Sulagna Maitra and I'm based in UCD Center for Humanitarian Action, and today I'm going to talk about the history of humanitarian action. Before we delve into the topic, it is important for you to be mindful of the learning outcomes or what you can expect to get out of this lecture. So let's go through the learning outcomes. The first one is to understand the origin and the roots of humanitarian action. The second one is to be familiar with the key events that shaped contemporary humanitarian action. So what we are going to do in this lecture today is to look at the global events such as the World Wars, the Cold War, 9/11, etc., and see how they shaped humanitarian action of that time. And then as an outcome of this, you'll be able to see the key features of contemporary humanitarian system, and then hopefully understand some of the key challenges that face humanitarian actors today. At this point, I would like to add a note on the lecture delivery or the lecture style. You'll notice that this lecture contains an audio narrative, so every slide will have an explanation with it. The presentation is divided into three main sections, and these main sections will be listed in the next slide. Some of the slides contain links to videos and websites for in-depth coverage of a specific concept or event, which I didn't want to go into because otherwise I would be digressing too much. What I would recommend is that you listen to the entire lecture first and then go back if you have the time or the interest, and you go back to these hyperlinks and then you can watch these links, or you use these links to kind of find out about an event that you're not familiar with. You'll notice that the references and the sources of pictures, etc., are mentioned all inside the slide text. And if you have any queries or if you want to discuss any of the issues further, feel free to email me directly, and my email address is available on the first slide of this presentation. The final point to help you get oriented is the order of presentation. As mentioned before, the lecture is divided into three main sections. First, the introduction, where there are these 4 questions that I want you to be mindful of while analyzing each era of humanitarian action. And then I'm going to discuss some of the key terms that you will frequently find yourself using during the course of your study. The next section is the humanitarian timeline, where the evolution of humanitarian action is analyzed in relation to key global events such as the World Wars, the Cold War, 9/11, and the War on Terror, etc. And finally, to close, I'm going to discuss the key points or the key takeaways from this lecture. Introduction. Before we proceed any further, I invite you to take a few minutes and watch this video produced by the ICRC, which celebrates 150 years of humanitarian action. 4 questions. If you look at the literature on humanitarian action, you'll find that most works deal with either one or many of these 4 questions that are here before you. The first question is, what is humanitarian action? This means, what is the definition of humanitarian action? And what makes an act a humanitarian act rather than a charitable or a philanthropic act? The second question is, who is a humanitarian actor, and more importantly, who is not? As we go through the timeline, you'll notice that the definition of who is a humanitarian and who is not is actually not very clear, and sometimes it has had very serious consequences for the humanitarian system and its personnel. The third question is, what is humanitarian action's link to politics? And again, you'll see that this question itself is also not clear. In this lecture, we are kind of analyzing the evolution of humanitarian action in relation to key geopolitical and political events. So you can actually assume that there is a strong link, inherent link between humanitarian action and politics. And yet humanitarian action, as you may have seen in the lectures on law, humanitarian action is supposed to be neutral, impartial, and independent of politics. This makes humanitarian action's link to politics extremely complicated and problematic. So how this has been handled in each of the specific era is also something that we are going to be looking at. And then the final question, how important are humanitarian motives? Is it enough to have the motive to be able to want to save lives, alleviating suffering? Or are other motives important, such as humanitarian efficiency? And depending on what motives we have or what motives humanitarian actors have, the delivery and the focus of humanitarian action might be different. So again, we are going to be looking at how important are the humanitarian motives and how just looking at motives may not always be enough. Humanitarian action has been defined variously. However, the most popular and widespread definition of humanitarian action can be found here, which is provided by the Good Humanitarian Donorship Alliance. And it is aid and action designed to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain and protect human dignity during and in the aftermath of disasters. There are a few things that I would like you to notice here. First of all, disasters can mean natural as well as man-made disasters such as conflict. And the second thing is that humanitarian action or aid consists of mainly two things. One is material assistance. So as you can see, a provision of food, water, shelter, medical assistance, etc. And the second element of humanitarian action is civil protection, or protection which essentially is the component of save lives and helping people live with dignity. And this involves implementation of international humanitarian law to protect civilians from harm. Next, I want to take a moment here to talk about humanitarianism and humanitarian aid or action. It is important to remember that humanitarianism is universal and timeless. It has existed since the beginning of human civilization, and it is rooted in compassion and this instinctive desire of every human being to help a fellow human being when they find themselves in any kind of difficulty or in the middle of a disaster. So nobody has a monopoly over humanitarianism per se, and it has existed, it continues to exist in individual, isolated forms, independent and actually irrespective of this major international system that we are all a part of or all are about to be a part of. Coming to humanitarian action, as we saw before, it is the act or it is the action or aid that is used to save lives, alleviate suffering, and help people live with dignity. And contemporary humanitarian action, which is actually what we are talking about today, is an international system. It is a global project. So the goal of this global project or this international project is to have this sort of an emergency, or what you call a 911 type of a system, which can reach anyone or anywhere, whoever is in a crisis. So the goal per se is actually a non-controversial one, and actually an admirable one, that to have a small, efficient and agile system that can reach anybody and anywhere, wherever there is a need and where the state themselves find it impossible or are unwilling to protect its own civilians. What you have in front of you is the diagram from the ALNAP State of the Humanitarian System study from 2015, which tried to depict the humanitarian system in terms of its actors and their linkages. And this was one of the first studies that actually tried to map systematically the humanitarian system. They made it very clear that this was the international humanitarian system that they were talking about. So what you have here is the affected communities at the center, and then surrounding it, you have a host of different actors, such as donors, the International Committee of the Red Cross, UN humanitarian agencies, international NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, national NGOs, diaspora groups, host governments, and there are actually a lot of the others that you cannot see on this slide, such as at the very corner, you'll be able to see military forces, then you have academia, and then a host of local communities, etc., which weren't actually captured by this study, but which are very much a part of the humanitarian system. The reason for presenting this slide to you at this point is to keep in mind that the international humanitarian system today is a large entity, large, evolving, dynamic entity with a lot of moving parts and a lot of complex relationships. So what we are going to study today is how it went from this whole idea of humanitarianism, which is individual acts of rescue for fellow human beings, to this multi-billion-dollar international system, which has all these norms, regulations, and all these complex relationships. From the structure of humanitarian system, we can also look at this entity as a business and the context. So if we look at the business, quote unquote, of humanitarian action, we see that in 2019, there was approximately $29.6 billion provided in humanitarian aid from mostly government donors, but also increasingly private donors. The ALNAP study that I talked about in 2015 mapped more than 4,000 national and international NGOs. And mind you, these are not counting the countless smaller national or local NGOs. So these are just international or national NGOs with ties to the international humanitarian system. It also mapped more than 500,000 aid workers, out of which you had more than 200,000 crisis response personnel. So the aid workers consists of development as well as humanitarian personnel, whereas the study found more than 200,000 people engaged in crisis response that consists of both generalists, so such as managers, logisticians, etc., as well as specialists like medical doctors. Now, when you look at the context of humanitarian action, you see that there is an ever-growing need, and actually humanitarian needs are at one of the highest since the Second World War. So in 2020, it is anticipated that more than 168 million people, that is about 1 in every 45 people in the world, is going to be needing humanitarian aid. According to the CRED study, there were 409 natural disasters that impacted more than 95 million people in 2019, and that cost about $103 billion in economic damages. There are also, on average, now the number of conflicts or violent conflicts, the counting of this is actually done using different matrices by different studies. So you'll find a wide variety of figures if you look at the various studies. But on average, there are about 300 plus conflicts going on in the world, and about 200 of them are actually violent conflicts. Similarly, figures released by the UNHCR say that more than 79.5 million people have been forced to flee their homes. A majority of them are internally displaced, that is, they are displaced within their own countries, and about 25 million of them are refugees, that is, they've crossed the border to another country. More than 1 billion people are living in countries currently that are facing long-term humanitarian crisis. Long-term humanitarian crisis refers to usually a crisis that have been going on for 5+ years, usually 8 to 10 years. And the worrying part in all of this is that in 2019-20, there was actually a reduction in the amount of humanitarian aid provided by government and private donors for the first time since 2012. So there was a 5.3% reduction in humanitarian aid provided as compared to 2018, while the humanitarian needs, are higher than ever before. So this meant that 1/3 of the requirements were actually not met. What this means is that usually on the front lines, there are about 60% of the projects, especially the UN projects, that are always under the threat of closing down due to lack of funds. So this is the context. This is the dire context in which humanitarian actors and the humanitarian system is operating. So the system constantly and the actors constantly need to search for ways that it can reach more people, but more efficiently, and provide the aid in accordance with humanitarian principles. The final concept that I want to discuss before moving into the humanitarian timeline is the concept of humanitarian space. Ronnie Brauman, the former president of MSF, is credited with coining the term humanitarian space to capture the idea of a notional space where humanitarian organizations could operate within the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Humanitarian organizations frequently adapt the definition of humanitarian space to suit their mandates and their projects, but the common understandings of the terms include that there is physical access to populations in need by humanitarian organizations, the ability of the population in question to access life-saving aid and protection, the ability of aid agencies to adhere to humanitarian principles without pressures from external agencies, and it frequently refers to the operating environment, that is, that there is a suitable or a conducive security, political, and economic situation which allows the delivery of humanitarian aid and protection. So on the diagram here that you see in front of you, you'll be able to see that humanitarian space is kind of this notional or conceptual space which is free from, or which is protected in some ways from, these different influences, including the foreign military operations, the geopolitical factors, foreign governments coming in, anti-government elements, donors that are pursuing their foreign policy objectives, different NGOs coming in with their own mandates, and the UN operations. So you have all these all these elements that influence humanitarian action and determine how much of humanitarian space is actually available for humanitarian actors. What has been frequently found through studies is that high political relevance or high political influence actually leads to a shrinking of humanitarian space, whereas low political influence or low political relevance leads to an expansion or maintenance of humanitarian space. And this is quite understandable. So if you have a conflict, say, for example, Afghanistan, where there were high stakes with the war on terror and there was major power influence, then there is a tendency to co-opt for the governments and the other powers to actually co-opt humanitarian organizations and try to manipulate them to suit their objectives. Whereas if you have a, a non-political, especially in the case of natural disasters, there is little political interest or influence, and therefore it is easier for humanitarian organizations to operate within the humanitarian principles. Section 2, the humanitarian timeline. We will now discuss the evolution of humanitarian action in context of key global events. What you have in front of you is a humanitarian timeline that has been developed. Now, it is by no means an exhaustive timeline, and you can add or take away events, and you may want to study the evolution of humanitarian action in another way, but this is one of the one of the simplest ways to study the evolution of humanitarian action. Now, what you have here at the top are the key political events or the international context. So you have the Battle of Solferino, World War I, World War II, then major events like the Cold War, and then regional conflicts like the Biafra conflict, and then the 9/11 war on terror. And then at the bottom, you have the evolution of humanitarian action and the key humanitarian events. Now we are just keep in mind this timeline or this picture, and you can come back to it whenever you want to sort of see where in this timeline you are, if you feel like you're getting a bit lost. The eras that we are going to discuss are marked here. What you will find is that I have spent a bit more time discussing the early periods compared to the second half, or especially when it comes to the post-Cold War era, because in the early periods, first of all, there is a bit more of history to go into, and also at this time, the events were quite disparate, and the humanitarian system was not that organized, or it was just coming into being. Whereas in the later parts, I focus not so much on the events per se or the conflicts per se, but I'll focus much more on the key characteristics of humanitarian action. We begin the humanitarian timeline with the international context just preceding the First World War. And it is important to remember that during this early times, people in general did not travel a lot. They mostly lived in small villages and had interactions with their immediate surroundings. So while there were empires and kingdoms all over the world, uh, the common people in general did not really travel great distances. Religion was a major source of charity and compassion and individual acts of philanthropy. And if you look at all major religions of the world, you will find the spirit of rescuing and helping fellow human beings in need as one of the core principles in all of these major religions. Then in the 17th and the early 18th century, you find that just after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, you have sovereign nation states emerging in Europe, and this actually changed the way international relations was organized. And for the first time, you have the emergence of nation states, which is the basis of contemporary international relations. And also, you find that European nations started to expand their influence beyond their immediate territories and started to colonize parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The expansion of European influence throughout the globe also resulted in the spread of this idea of a nation state and territorial sovereignty, which were the two core principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, and today they are actually enshrined in international law and is forms the basis of every form of international relations that we can think of. In the 19th century, you have Europe itself going through reorganization just after the Napoleonic Wars. And while the Congress of Vienna couldn't manage to restore peace per se, it did try to bring in this concept of balance of power, another key concept within international relations for the first time into the language of politics in Europe. At the same time, you find this whole idea of imperialism taking hold, and different European powers started to carve up different parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America for themselves. So in 1823, you have US declaring that Latin America as its sphere of influence to ward off European powers via the Monroe Doctrine. Then you have, through the Berlin Conference, all the major powers sort of carving out different territories for themselves. You can find out more about these important events through the hyperlinks. Another important feature of this period was the two great famines that took place in India and in Ireland. And we see for the first time the emergence of, or the seeds of humanitarian action per se, where external agencies such as the East India Company provided relief and implemented programs such as food or cash for work. Now, it goes without saying that the East India Company and the UK were part of the reason which caused the famine. But on the other hand, you also see the emergence of this international humanitarian aid coming into these areas. What you have here on the slide before you is the basically how the world was carved up by the different colonial powers on the eve of the First World War. This is actually from an article from Vox.com, and the picture is hyperlinked, and you can, when you have time, you can actually go and read about the 500 years of colonialism to get a better understanding of the phenomena. Having discussed the political context and the humanitarian context of the pre-World War I era, I want you to notice or keep in mind three developments that actually changed the course of humanitarian action and is often credited as the reason or the origin or the starting point of international humanitarian action. And these are all actually, they can be credited to one man, Henri Dunant, and his experience at the Battle of Solferino, which resulted in him writing a memory of Solferino and then lobbying and advocating with officials in Switzerland and beyond to form the International Committee of the Red Cross and the ICRC movement in 1863, and also the first Geneva Convention for amelioration of the conditions of wounded in armies in the field in 1864, which provides the basis for international humanitarian law. I now invite you to watch this video produced by the ICRC. It's called The Story of an Idea, and it shows the Henri Dunant's experience at the Battle of Solferino and the birth of ICRC. The next major global event that shaped humanitarian assistance was the First World War. World War I was the first global war with unprecedented death and destruction. Two features that distinguish this war from previous ones were, number one, its global scale and impact. Remember, at this point in time, all the major European powers had colonies all over the world, which got dragged into the war. And number two, that the number of civilian casualties matched that of the military personnel. One study found that a total of 9.7 million military personnel perished in the World War I, while the civilian casualties were slightly higher at 10 million people. Two major events that had a massive impact on humanitarian action were, number one, the emergence of Save the Children, and you can click on this link to find out more about the establishment of the organization. And the second one was Woodrow Wilson's 14 points that laid the foundation of international cooperation and eventually led to the founding of the League of Nations. Now, while the League of Nations actually did not survive and was not successful in preventing the Second World War, what is important to notice, or what is important to note here, is that for the first time you had a major political leader, that is the US president, enunciating concrete points for international cooperation that would ensure lasting peace. So, for the first time, there is this idea that nations can cooperate through a global organization and can ensure um, trade and cooperation and peace, and do away with the unnecessary aspects of international relations such as war. So Woodrow Wilson's 14 points sought a basis for ending World War I and to build lasting peace. It sought the freedom of seas, open covenants, principle of self-determination, democracy, and free trade. It mooted the idea of a League of Nations to enforce peace, and it talked about morality, ethics, and cooperation as a basis for international relations. If you stop and think about these points, and especially the words that are highlighted here, for example, build lasting peace, freedom, principle of self-determination, democracy, free trade, the idea of a supranational organization that would enforce peace, and then morality and ethics of cooperation, you will see that these are the very ideas that form the basis of contemporary international relations and are at the foundation of United Nations. These are also the principles or the values that are at the heart of any reconstruction project in a post-war context in any of the countries today. So what you have at the end of the First World War with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points is the emergence for the first time of this idea of cooperation and certain core values such as peace, freedom, democracy, self-determination, free trade, etc. And of course, the idea of an organization, a global organization for maintaining peace that exists and form the basis of international humanitarian assistance today. I want to take a minute here to talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917, and I'm not going to go into extensive details about this. If you click on this picture here, there is a link to a BBC documentary that provides a very detailed background to what was going on in Russia and the events leading up to the Russian Revolution. But what is important to note here is that the First World War was actually one of the catalysts, along with local conditions, that instigated the Russian Revolution. The movement was led by Lenin, based on the Marxist-Leninist ideology, and it eventually led to the establishment of USSR, or the Soviet Socialist Republic, which provided an alternative form of governance to what existed in Europe and America. The First World War and events like the Russian Revolution actually sowed the seeds of international humanitarian system. And we can look at it in two ways. First of all, in terms of the humanitarian issues in the aftermath of the First World War, you have issues not just of mass casualty, but you also have epidemics like the influenza pandemic of 1918 that killed nearly 40 million people. You have issues of food security, public health, and nutrition. And you also have mass displacement and statelessness, including flights of minority groups. To respond to these vast humanitarian and unprecedented humanitarian needs, you have reforms within the international system that served as a precursor to the contemporary humanitarian system that actually emerged after the Second World War. So the first thing that happened was the emergence of permanent transnational institutions that were secular regimes and that were designed to address root causes of suffering. And I'm going to give you some concrete examples in the next slide. The second thing that happened was what is known as cultural reconfiguration of civil mentalities. That is, from thinking about every problem in sort of a national context or prioritizing national sovereignty and territorial integrity above everything else, we have the concept of a global civil society emerging with shared rights and responsibilities. This is because the First World War was the first global war that led to the same kind of human miseries spread across regions, across states, across territories. And therefore, people started thinking not just in terms of national boundaries, but also in terms of a global civil society and collectively responding to these humanitarian needs. So here we're going to talk about some of the major developments in the humanitarian system, especially in terms of institutional development. So in the previous slide, we talked about emergence of these secular regimes to deal with sort of root causes of humanitarian need. And you have different types of regimes emerging. So first of all, you have welfare regimes emerging within states, so such as the New Deal in the US. Then secondly, you have establishment of international organization to deal with humanitarian issues specifically. So for example, you have the League of Nations, which was the first permanent international organization whose mission was to maintain world peace, and its tasks included collective security, labor conditions, treatment of indigenous inhabitants in the colonies, protection of minorities and displaced in Europe. And you can see that from the language that is incorporated here, that these are the precursors to the contemporary humanitarian system. Then you also had emergence of other organizations and regimes which were international and transnational, and they were on specific areas such as health. And you had emergence of humanitarian agencies with its ideological variants. So while in the so-called West you had the emergence of the League of the Red Cross and Save the Children, in Soviet Russia you had Workers' International Relief and the International Red Aid. Another major development in terms of protection of refugees was this whole idea of providing a document for a person who was forced to flee their homes, which was this concept of the Nansen passport. And again, here we see another act of individual leadership that actually had a massive influence on humanitarian system, especially on the protection of refugees. I invite you actually to look at this video associated with the Nansen passport here to learn more about it. The interwar period, of course, was not without its challenges to the liberal peace project. And what you have is, first of all, the Great Depression and World War II that negated the argument that economic interdependence can actually help maintain world peace. Then, secondly, we find that the League of Nations was overwhelmed and unsupported In fact, even though Woodrow Wilson was the first proponent of the League of Nations, America eventually failed to join the League of Nations, and eventually the organization failed to prevent the Second World War. Then pre-1949 Geneva Conventions did not actually cover civilians subjected to brutality by their own governments, so this was a major shortcoming. And finally, the ICRC, while being able to maintain nominal access during civil wars, failed to speak out against the atrocities and inhuman practices that were going on during these civil wars. And actually, USSR at one point advocated for the dissolution of the ICRC because of its failings. The Second World War from 1939 to 1945 was even more devastating than the First World War in terms of its reach and impact. It was a global war that was fought between Axis powers and the Allied forces in Europe, Russia, North Africa, and Asia. Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and Ireland remained neutral in this war. 60 million people died, and approximately 40 million of them were civilians. And again, there are estimates of 6 million Jewish people being killed in Nazi concentration camps. The war ended with the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The unprecedented death and destruction caused by the Second World War necessitated a coordinated international response to the great humanitarian needs that emerged. And therefore, you have the emergence of various international organizations, most notably the UN. So first you have United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which was established in 1943 and existed from 1943 to 1947. This is often referred to as the original UN, and its mandate was to provide aid, rehabilitation, and resettlement assistance. The United Nations was officially inaugurated at San Francisco Conference in April 1945. 50 countries ratified the UN Charter, and the name United Nations was actually coined by US President Roosevelt in 1942. The mandate for United Nations actually included world peace, friendly relations among nations, a center for harmonizing actions to tackle global challenges such as hunger, violation of human rights, and to help resolve conflicts, etc. The UN also had certain specialized agencies to deal with some of the specific needs, and these were the precursors for agencies such as the UNHCR, UNICEF, FAO, the World Food Programme, and UNDRO. Along with the establishment of international organizations, you also have, for the first time, the sort of massive aid, reconstruction aid being provided. So, for example, the Marshall Plan in 1948 was aid given from US for the reconstruction of Europe. And at the same time, you have the emergence of major humanitarian organizations like Oxfam in the UK and CARE in the US. So you can see that in the aftermath of the Second World War, you very much have the international humanitarian system coming of age and sort of getting the shape that we know it today. Before we go into Cold War and humanitarian action, which is significantly different from this humanitarian assistance during the world wars and before it, I want to highlight some of the key features of humanitarian assistance during this period. So the important points are, first of all, it is important to note that these were more than simple acts of generosity or charity. This was a safety net specifically created for the most vulnerable people affected by disasters, whether it was man-made or natural. Secondly, this humanitarian assistance involved material assistance plus ways to regain rights and dignity as human beings. The aim of humanitarian assistance in this period was to build spaces of normalcy within crisis. So, where political institutions have failed or they are in crisis, and it was essentially still a citizen's response to political failure. The operation or the operating framework was within international humanitarian law and the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, but these norms were still evolving and very much in their early stages. However, the feature of this humanitarian system was that it was universal, it didn't have any frontiers, and it was short term, a limited group with limited objectives, and it was avowedly apolitical. This is important to keep in mind before we move forward because we'll see how these key features change throughout the different periods that we are going to discuss in the forthcoming slides. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, while on the one hand there was the UN that was established to ensure peace and security, and its various agencies were trying to cope with the unprecedented humanitarian needs, there were tensions that were brewing between the victorious powers, especially United States, UK, and USSR. And this is actually the origin of the Cold War period, where the world was divided into mainly two ideological blocks. That is, one, the capitalist bloc led by United States of America, and the socialist and communist bloc led by USSR and later also co-led by China. With the Truman Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine is generally regarded as the start of the Cold War. Churchill spoke about this Iron Curtain that had descended across the continent, and both America, as a result of this competition and tension, both America and USSR got involved in a major race to expand their influence and contain the influence of the opposite power across different parts of the world. In this section, we are going to talk about the Cold War and its impact on the evolution of humanitarian assistance. The map before you shows the world divided into the various blocks. So the blue countries represent countries that aligned themselves with the American bloc or the capitalist bloc. The red countries denote those that align themselves with the Soviet or the socialist bloc, and the gray countries are a host of newly independent countries, mainly in Asia and Africa, that formed the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement claimed that they could not afford, as newly independent countries, to align themselves with either of the blocs because they had to focus on their national development and fostering relations with as many countries in the world as possible. So they, just after emerging from colonialism and hundreds of years of imperialistic rule, they did not want to again give up their sovereignty, even a little bit, and align themselves with either of these blocs. You'll notice that some of these alliances, they exist even to this day, and whether the relations formally exist or not, the bonds that were formed or the alliances that were formed during the Cold War era continue to shape both international politics as well as humanitarian action. The Cold War did not lead to an outright war between the enemies USSR and US. However, there were several geopolitical flashpoints, and the images that you see here in front of you are from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Cambodian Khmer Rouge genocide. So while there wasn't any outright war between the two main parties, there were proxy wars across the globe that led to massive civilian casualties, use of chemical and biological warfare, and rampant violation of human rights and civil protection by the invading powers. So, if we just take the example of Indochina or Southeast Asia, we find that the Korean War in the 1950s had more than 4 million Chinese and Korean casualties, and almost 34,000 US combatants were killed in that conflict. The Vietnam War had multiple examples of human rights violations by the invading superpowers. However, little effort was made by any state or organization to protect the civilians. In fact, people are still waiting for compensation for use of chemicals in the fields in Vietnam that actually wiped out vegetations and converted massive areas of arable land into completely unusable land. Then, of course, you must have heard of the genocide in Cambodia, which again, the Khmer Rouge coming to power was again a direct result of the war in Vietnam. And in spite of awareness within the international system and within the UN about these atrocities going on, the UN was mostly paralyzed by bloc politics and could not intervene effectively to stop these humanitarian crises. We can now turn our attention to the evolution of aid during the Cold War, and we are going to talk about a few of the trends that emerged. So this was the period when you have to remember that colonialism was coming to an end. So 1960s, for example, that is known as the Year of Africa. That is when most of the African countries got their independence from colonial powers. So aid in this era was really used as a tool to maintain the linkages, the formal colonial linkages between the imperialist powers and their colonies. So in the 1950s and the early 1960s, you see a rapid rise in foreign aid, we discussed, to retain influence. US, USSR, France, and UK, these were the major donors. And while the US focused to contain the Sino Soviet influence, and in order to maximize its powers, UK and France mainly provided aid to its former colonies. Then from the mid-60s to the 1970s, early 1970s, this is the period when we find that within the foreign ministry, we find that separate ministries or separate agencies being set up for that exclusively dealt with development aid. This is when humanitarian aid per se wasn't still distinguished from development aid, but the aid sector per se was very much coming into being. US was still the major player and provided of almost one third of overall total overseas development aid. However, we do have the emergence of new donors such as the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, which came in with a more principled view towards humanitarian action and development aid. At this point, the UN General Assembly also passed a resolution, and this is where actually this resolution was passed through the concerted efforts of the NAM countries or the non-aligned countries that decided to vote in blocks at the General Assembly so that they could pass certain resolutions that would change the economic imbalance between the haves and the have-nots in the global structure. So, for example, they proposed the new international economic order, whereby the resolution required that donor countries would target to provide 0.7% of their GNP and aid. Now, countries in general have a poor record of this. So, even though this resolution was passed in early 1970s, countries still most of the countries still have yet to reach this target. The mid 1970s and the 1980s, they were actually quite a difficult and quite a tumultuous time. First of all, the oil crisis in the Middle East and the resulting recession increased the needs in the development world and sent out shockwaves throughout the developed world as well. And for the first time, the whole idea of security was reconceptualized. We'll see that again, the idea of security being reconceptualized after 9/11. But the oil crisis showed that countries and economies were vulnerable, and not just militarily vulnerable, but also vulnerable to economic shocks, pandemics, etc. So the whole idea of security was expanded. Then there were several crises in sub-Saharan Africa, and this was the region that became the major focus, especially for the Nordic countries that wanted to focus on the most marginalized. US still retained its power as providing 1/5 of the total aid. However, due to the growth of the US economy, it actually it wasn't a big proportion of its GNP, and its share within due to the emergence of other donors, its share in the overall aid sector started to decline or decline. So, what were some of the consequences of this bloc politics on humanitarian action in general? First of all, there was widespread awareness and therefore protest within the major powers against these Cold War conflicts. So, in America, especially, also in the UK, you find civilian mass protests against the wars, and this extended to popular culture as well. The UN, in spite of its makeup and trying to avoid the problems of the League of Nations, it was not effective in intervening effectively in any of these proxy wars, and actually it remained paralyzed throughout most of the Cold War period. Um, However, where the UN and organizations like the Red Cross failed, individuals and charitable organizations were able to get more success in terms of reaching people in need. And humanitarians, and mostly individual humanitarians or small organizations, they use their links with certain specific rebel groups, certain people in need, with resistance fighters, to access vulnerable population. And therefore this was sort of humanitarian action that was provided very clandestinely and often in violation of the principle of neutrality. So while you have, on the one hand, Red Cross had to wait several years to get access in Indochina, some of the other humanitarian actors were able to gain access to these populations, even though it was in breach of the principle of neutrality, and it was often done in very covert ways. So this era is actually known as almost a romantic idea of a humanitarian worker. And when you listen to a lot of the current leaders in the humanitarian sector, you will hear them say about that they just wanted to help people, so they packed their bags and went to a place where they could make a difference. So this the whole idea of a sort of a vulnerable humanitarian worker that did not have the backing of a state, that did not come with massive resources, but only had its motives, its pure motives of helping people in need, and therefore was invincible. This took hold. That so so and this was attractive, and this was what they believed would keep them safe and give them access to the different population. One of the most consequential conflicts in terms of impact on the humanitarian sector was the Biafran War, or the Nigerian Civil War. Uh, this was a complex emergency that involved political, economic, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions. The persecution of Igbo people by the federal government of Nigeria led to almost 30,000 casualties within a very short period of time. And along with the human misery, this was the time that it really challenged humanitarian actors in terms of their motives and what they were there to do. Driven by the Cold War tensions, and there was actually a reluctance within the international community to accept the creation of a new unstable African state, which was at the heart of the Biafran conflict. And Britain and the Soviet Union actually supported the Nigerian government, while France and Israel supported Biafra. This was also one of the conflicts during the Cold War period where the government was massacring its own people, and the federal government responded with a huge mounted a huge military response. It cut off sources of revenue, and used gender-based violence and starvation as a strategy for war, leading to almost 2 million casualties. The organizations such as the ICRC were eventually forced to remove themselves, and even though they were present in the area, they refused to speak out. The Biafran conflict actually brought forward a lot of tensions. For example, within the humanitarian sector, there were debates as a result. So, for example, whether they could choose, or whether they needed to choose between national sovereignty or regional self determination, how humanitarian action and humanitarian assistance was being politicized and instrumentalized to further sustain the conflict, because some of the organizations like the ICRC did not speak out against the conflict, therefore trying to end the conflict, and at the same time kept on providing humanitarian aid and protection to the civilians, so therefore, in some ways, prolonging the conflict. Physical security of humanitarian actors also became a major issue, and maintaining political neutrality versus belligerence while expressing solidarity with humans who were caught within the conflict almost became impossible. So these were some of these core ideas that you find that even humanitarian actors are facing today. These came to the forefront during the Biafra conflict. Two major organizations to emerge as a direct consequence of the Biafra conflict are Concerned Worldwide, which is the largest Irish humanitarian NGO, and MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, that was established by a group of doctors and journalists who were previously working for the ICRC but could not agree with the ICRC's policy of not speaking out. I now invite you to watch these two very short videos. The first one is about the establishment of Concerned Worldwide, and the second one is a short interview of Dr. Bernard Kouchner, with the BBC, where he explains the rationale for the establishment of MSF, or Doctors Without Borders. Another major feature that defined humanitarian action during the later part of the Cold War was the tremendous influence of media and telecommunication, and the involvement of global celebrities in mobilizing people and raising funds for the most marginalized communities. So, with the African famines happening in the late 1970s and the early 80s, most notably in Ethiopia, you have celebrities like Bob Geldof organizing Live Aid with massive participation that raised millions for the purpose of providing relief uh, to people in need in Ethiopia. And this again, this the impact of with the impact of media, it wasn't possible for governments or people to ignore anymore what was going on in the rest of the world, and this really helped with the feeling of solidarity within the global civil society. In this video, you have former Irish President Miss Mary Robinson talking about in a very emotionally charged press conference about the role of media and um, how the people around the globe, here she's visiting Somalia, that how they are no longer distant, remote people that you can just forget about, and how there needs to be some kind of action and protection for the most marginalized around the world. So, as we discussed before, towards the end of the Cold War, you really have this role of media becoming increasingly prominent. So, for example, during the Ethiopian famine, the stark media images, some of which you've seen before, they were relayed to the televisions in the drawing rooms of people around the globe just before Christmas, which led to an outpouring of public support, and for the first time, the general public became became donors in a significant way. Also, the Ethiopian famine led to the birth of early warning systems, especially managed by the UN. And then you have in 1989 Operation Lifeline Sudan, which was the first major UN federated operation in humanitarian assistance, and it consisted of UN agencies, the World Food Programme, as well as 35 major NGOs. The end of the Cold War marked another major shift in humanitarian action because of, again, the geopolitical context that the end of the Cold War created. So, for example, with the conflict between the superpowers gone, some of the countries like Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc., lost their strategic relevance to the major superpowers, and therefore there was a reduction in materials and military support that these countries and their various warring parties received. However, the conflicts or the proxy wars that were going on in these countries did not really go away overnight. So we'll see in a bit what were the consequences, or what were the humanitarian consequences, because the nature of the crisis, the nature of the wars changed, and that meant that there needed to be a change in humanitarian action as well. So what you have is a lot of soul searching, because you'll see that some of the major and the most brutal genocides and conflicts, intrastate conflicts, actually took place in this period, and humanitarians were forced to confront the fact that that romantic idea that humanitarian motives are just enough were probably needed to be challenged. Secondly, there was a radical shift in the conceptualization of security, and human security came to the forefront. So, this happened because there were a group of economists emerging from the global south, mostly from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, etc., who wanted to change the narrative, who wanted to change the dialogue from from talking security in terms of national security, economic security, to human security that is focusing on uh, the providing humans with every, or citizens with every support possible, so that they can realize their full potential. So this is it is during this period, actually in 1994, that we also have the emergence of the Human Development Index that is used so widely today. So, yeah, as mentioned before, there were new wars and complex emergencies, and this period also, so the period from 1990 onwards also saw an increase in humanitarian aid as a proportion of, but as separate from development aid. Now, while on the one hand you do have, humanitarian action coming into its own, you also have the tendency for international organizations as well as state governments to instrumentalize humanitarian action and co-opt humanitarian action in some of their activities. And one of the reasons was that, as we talked before, media became a major factor. There was awareness within among the citizens about their country's involvement in different civil wars around the globe, and there were protests. There was awareness about humanitarian crises such as the Ethiopian famine. So basically, not taking action was no longer possible for the governments because there was tremendous internal pressure to do so. So, in such contexts, humanitarian action often became an alibi, and this is also known as medicalization of the problem. For example, that instead of these states and their governments actually taking proactive steps to resolve the conflict, they used humanitarian aid as a way to expand their influence, as a way to not act politically but provide humanitarian aid, which was just medical support, food, water, shelter, etc. Three major conflicts that had a massive impact on the humanitarian actors during this phase were the Rwandan genocide, the war in between Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the war in Kosovo. And while the particularities of each of these conflicts are different, there are a few common themes. First of all these conflicts were regional, and they were based on identity issues or mobilization of different identities against each other. Secondly, the UN, in spite of having all the information, actually remained largely ineffective in either preventing the conflict or actually effectively stopping the conflict. The major powers that were involved in all these conflicts actually, in the ultimate analysis, tried to protect their interest rather than to protect the civilians. And all these three conflicts, they led to a soul searching within the humanitarian actors to see, to question their motives, to question their delivery, and to see what and led to the recognition that they could no longer deny the fact that just by bringing in resources in a resource scarce environment, in that too within a politically charged environment like a conflict, humanitarian actors could no longer deny that, in spite of their intentions, in spite of everything, they are bound to have a massive impact on the conflict, and therefore they needed to be mindful and they needed to be conscious of the impact of their actions, and they could no longer claim that the humanitarian corridor or the humanitarian space existed irrespective or independent of the political surrounding political situation. So here you have a summary of what we were discussing before, that in the post Cold War global context, there are no major or superpowers balancing, managing, or containing intrastate or regional conflicts. So, factional politics that existed at the subnational, national, or the regional level, they actually resurfaced because there wasn't this lid, which was the bloc politics that was sort of containing and managing these local conflicts. So it was really like opening a Pandora's box, that all these ethnic conflicts and minor conflicts erupted soon after major powers withdrew from these regions. The superpower funding, with lack of strategic relevance, superpower funding to civil wars as part of the Cold War also dried up, and US and Russia withdrew from non-strategic areas. Therefore, what the local actors or the local warring parties, they found that the conflict was still going on. However, they didn't have resources to fund it. So conflict actors turned to targeting humanitarian aid and exploiting mineral resources and other illegal means to sustain the conflict. This created an entirely new and challenging context for humanitarian actors that comprised of complex intrastate conflicts that had its root in history, ethnicity, structural poverty, etc. So, issues that are well beyond the means of the humanitarian actors or their mandate. So humanitarian actors began to realize, or they needed to realize, that it was no longer possible to provide aid without having any kind of impact on the conflicts, and therefore they, rather than to deny this their role, they should actually proactively find out what their impact was, what their role was, and try to minimize the harm. So this is why during this period you also have the emergence of the doctrine of do no harm by Mary Anderson. So here from the Uppsala conflict database, you can see that there was a massive rise in the intrastate conflicts as compared to interstate or other types of conflicts, especially around the 1990s. So, this is where, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, you have a massive increase in intrastate conflict. So now we take a few minutes to understand what these complex humanitarian emergencies were and some of the characteristics of these new wars. So, complex humanitarian crises usually were characterized by state failure, refugee flight, existence of militia and warrior refugees. So these were refugees, but also associated with one or two of the warring parties. So the new wars, or the new types of wars that emerged, where the locus of the war was domestic, it was almost exclusively civil. The agents of the war were an assortment of combatants, including national armies, militia, paramilitaries, warlords, and child soldiers, etc. The parties relied on creative sources of funding. So, this is really another way of talking about the targeting of humanitarian actors. And uh, civilians were no longer an unfortunate casualty of a war, but they were very much part of the war now. So this is a massive difference as compared to the previous eras, such as during the world wars. On this slide, again from the Uppsala conflict database, you can see that majority of these non-state conflicts when looked at, analyzed by region, you find that they were mostly located in Africa. So in the 1990s, you really have the impact of media coming into play in a much more concrete and discernible way. And this is frequently known as the CNN effect. So, as media savvy aid workers also began to understand the power of stark images and how that can be used to raise awareness but also to raise funds. And what was found was that news coverage or media coverage of major crisis led to a direct link with increase in funding provided by the public. So, what was the flip side of it? The flip side of it was that emergencies and crises that did not get covered by the media were forgotten crises. And if you look at DG ECHO's lists today, you will find that it has a list of forgotten crises, that is, crises which have sort of fallen off the radar, that which remain very much where the humanitarian needs are great. However, these are not on the international political radar or on public's minds because there is not much awareness about them. So the UN General Assembly Resolution 45 by 100 passed in on 14th of December 1990 talked about the humanitarian assistance to victims of natural disasters and similar emergency situations. It reaffirmed the cardinal importance of humanitarian assistance for victims of natural disasters and similar emergency situations. It also reaffirmed, very importantly, the sovereignty of affected states and their primary role in initiation, organization, and coordination of the humanitarian response. So it stressed that important contribution made in providing humanitarian assistance by intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. They would be working with the host government impartially and with strictly humanitarian motives. So the resolution also invited all states whose populations were in need of such assistance to facilitate and work with these organizations to implement humanitarian assistance. Similarly, the General Assembly resolution of 1991 that focused on strengthening of the coordination of humanitarian emergency assistance, and it had certain areas of focus, which was prevention, preparedness and early warning, a standby capacity or a contingency fund with additional measures for rapid response, consolidated appeals, and coordination, cooperation, and leadership. Therefore, it talked about leadership of the Secretary General, an interagency standing committee, and country level coordination. It also stressed on the continuum from relief to rehabilitation and development. Along with the UN resolutions, we also have several other initiatives. So, for example, the Learning Partnership, that is ALNAP, People in Aid, which promotes good practice, the Sphere Project that came out or as an immediate aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, and of course the Interagency Standing Committee. We now come to the final phase of the evolution of humanitarian action, which is humanitarian action in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. What you have before you here on this slide is a list of major events, and this was prepared by one of the former NOHA students group as part of their World Politics project, and it lists chronologically some of the key developments in this phase up till 2016. The first impact that we have of 9/11 and the resulting war on terror on humanitarian action is this whole idea of stabilization. That is, there was this realization that countries or spaces that are unstable or fragile and that exist in maybe even in remote areas of the world, they can still be security threats. So security per se was redefined as political, military, social, economic, as well as environmental stability. So you see that really there has been an expansion in the notion of security from traditional security in during the world wars to the whole idea of economic security in the 1970s during the oil crisis to the whole concept of human security in the 1990s. We now have a much more comprehensive definition of security that includes political, military, social, economic, as well as environmental stability. So the whole idea of interventions was to interventions in these countries, in these so-called fragile areas around the world, was to achieve a safe and secure environment, to establish the rule of law, to achieve good governance, to establish a viable market economy, as well as to promote psychosocial well-being. So you can see how comprehensive it is, and it is very much it has very much to do with social and political engineering. Um, so and so this and here humanitarians, we will see in a minute that humanitarians were really just one of the agencies that were going in to these fragile areas or these conflict ridden areas. And the another shift was from the previous era. So if we look at the 1980s and the 1990s, the whole idea at that point in time, the whole idea was for humanitarian actors was rescue, and then the whole idea for development organizations was change. And so they were looking to secure development or to achieve development for the areas that they were working in. Whereas in the post 9/11 era, it was all about securitizing development. That is, development of these areas was necessary for the security and stability of the major countries or the so-called donor countries. So therefore, reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, economic stability, providing aid was no longer an act of charity or aid or something that was even a bit more fuzzy as maintaining your influence with your former colonies. It was very much directly related to the immediate security of the nations around the world, and therefore development was securitized. So on this slide from Brendan O'Shea, who is a colonel in the Irish Army, you see he provides this this picture of what the stabilization and other policy areas, the overlaps are. So here you see that in going from war to peace, and you'll see that the arrows are in both sides because it's not a linear process. It can, at any point in time, it can go back. You have at the top here you have counterterrorism and counter narcotics. Then you have other security operations like insurgency. But here, from going from war to peace, you first have the humanitarian intervention, then you have the stabilization and the early recovery phase, then you go into peace building, then development and state building. Again, you'll see that it starts in the early recovery phase and continues well into the peace phase. So this picture, this diagram really shows you the overlap between the different spheres. So the three core functions in post-war reconstruction in any region are peace building, that is to overcome the structural and cultural violence and to make peace between conflict parties; nation building, that is to forge an identity of diverse populations so that the new state's citizenship can transcend all these other loyalties and lead to the establishment of a peaceful state; and then state building, which is to build self sustaining governance structures that can deliver essential public goods are required to gain the trust and legitimacy and ultimately to ensure peace. So, this is a very, very comprehensive idea of post war reconstruction and humanitarian action that we see here. One of the most prominent and obvious case studies to understand this is, of course, of the intervention in Afghanistan as part of the war on terror. Here you'll find that all the major donors except China, Ireland, and India were also the belligerents, thus confusing the lines between humanitarian donors and warring parties. The UN was fully aligned with one set of belligerents. Assistance by the military and through the provisional reconstruction teams, they were doing more than just intervening militarily. Their job was to win hearts and minds. So the lines between the military personnel perform there for a military intervention and humanitarian actors began to blur. So quick impact projects. So these teams implemented quick impact projects, small scale local development projects to foster peace dividends, and the National Solidarity Program was also established to support local development to resolve mistrust of government institutions. Now we can, in spite of all these developments, it is important for us to stop at this point and actually investigate whether all these measures and whether having a more expansive definition of humanitarian action has it actually worked. And we find that the jury is still out there because we see that there has been an increase, a massive increase actually, in the size of UN global humanitarian appeals. It has increased from 3.4 billion in 2003 to 18.7 billion in 2015. Then 90% of the UN humanitarian appeals continue for more than 3 years, and approximately 66% of humanitarian assistance goes to long-term recipient countries. This really means that while humanitarian actors continue to intervene in newer conflicts, the older conflicts or older humanitarian crises are actually not going away. Since 2002, an average of approximately 100 humanitarian personnel have been killed per annum, and national staff of international NGOs, local organizations, and the Red Cross movement constitute 90% of these casualties. So, as a result of local warriors and local warring parties targeting humanitarian actors or trying to co-opt them, the security of humanitarian actors has become an increasing source of concern. Then another thing is the involvement of private or for-profit enterprises in reconstruction. For example, as we saw in Afghanistan, has also diminished the chances of protection and assistance to vulnerable populations on the basis of humanitarian principles such as humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Finally, there is also a sharp fluctuation in the availability of aid. So what you find is that when a crisis occurs, there's an immediate spike in the aid followed by a rapid decline, and usually at about 5 years after the conflict ends, as the attention usually wanes. So what you have through these reconstruction projects, which are these UN mandates, is that there are so many agencies, there are so many agendas at play that usually that leads to competing agendas of development, humanitarian action, and peace building, and there is lack of clarity of roles, and also due to so many the preponderance of humanitarian actors, of external humanitarian actors, it actually subverts local capacity. Another major event during the 2000s was the Indian Ocean tsunami, and this caused widespread devastation around the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, and really it in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was a lot of again lot of development on disaster risk reduction and disaster preparedness, which wasn't available before. While the 2000s brought untold misery in terms of conflicts and natural disasters, the humanitarian sector, especially under the leadership of UN OCHA, continued its endeavor to improve the efficiency of the delivery of aid, and therefore the humanitarian reform agenda was launched in 2005 to improve capacity, predictability, accountability, leadership, and partnership, and it created the cluster approach that you can see here, and you'll be learning a lot more about the cluster approach during your management modules. Similarly, you have other initiatives emerging as well between countries, between organizations. So you have the Humanitarian Standards Partnership, the Responsibility to Protect, Humanitarian Accountability Partnership or HAP, and the Good Humanitarian Donorship. And the purpose of all of these is to improve accountability, to improve donor practices, as well as to make sure that the relief provided to the population is of meets certain minimum standards. So 2010 here deserves a mention because there were a multiple crises, and actually it was one of the years that saw the highest increase in availability of humanitarian aid as well. So we have the Ethiopian famine, the food insecurity in Niger, floods in Pakistan, and the earthquake in Haiti. And so the massive scale of humanitarian crises also led to involvement of humanitarian actors in a massive way. It put a huge stress on the already overstretched humanitarian system, and thus it was realized that there needed to be questions asked about the appropriateness and adequacy of the response, and also to have a more of a root and branch review of how humanitarian aid is provided in order to make sure that the humanitarian sector was being as effective as it could be. The next important political event that rocked the world was the Arab Spring. And here on your slide, you can see the countries that were mostly affected by it. The Arab Spring it led to mass mobilization of citizens. It created a lot of instability and instigated some conflicts in the region, some of which actually had impact on future conflicts which have happened over the last few years. So in 2011, the IASC, or the Interagency Standing Committee, it adopted the transformative agenda. So you notice that the humanitarian reform agenda was launched in 2005, and then in 2010 the transformative agenda was launched. So every 5 year, OCHA undertakes a review of its practices and adopts and tries to adapt and come up with new ways of making the system, the humanitarian system, more effective. For at the moment, you will hear a lot about the humanitarian nexus, which again tries to build on the best capacities of each of the humanitarians, the development, and the peace building actors. So the transformative agenda had three pillars: leadership, coordination, and accountability. And again, you're going to be learning much more about this in your management module. The next major development was the HAP, that is the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, People in Aid, and the Sphere Project coming together to form the core humanitarian standards. And this has really evolved from from the different standards that we talked about before. So from now on, what you're going to notice within the humanitarian sector is the intention to synthesize the different standards, the different codes that exist, and to make them more accessible and more implementable, so that there is also greater accountability towards them. I now invite you to watch this short video on the core humanitarian standards. The next major event to take place was the World Humanitarian Summit, which was a result of 2 years of consultations with humanitarian actors taking a bottom up approach. And here again, I will invite you to watch this short video on the main outcomes and highlights of the World Humanitarian Summit. The World Humanitarian Summit created the Agenda for Humanity document that I'm sure you're going to hear about in much more detail in the forthcoming sessions. But the purpose for Agenda for Humanity was it focused on a few areas, such as to prevent and end conflict, to respect the rule of law, to leave no one behind, to work differently to end need and also to invest in humanity. And over the last few years, so between 2015 and 16, we really see the beginnings of joined up thinking. So you have the Paris Climate Agreement, the Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, as well as the Humanitarian Summit. And they all actually reference each other, and so slowly you see some kind of joined up thinking happening between natural disasters, so thinking around humanitarian action, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. Another thing that has happened over the last few years is the uh, is actually the indexing of the Agenda for Humanity goals with the Sustainable Development Goals. So here, for every Sustainable Development Goal, there is the most immediate urgent needs are the ones that the humanitarian actors are looking to provide and support with. So, really, this is where the humanitarian system, mostly under the UN, is coming into its own and trying to fulfill that ambition that we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture, which was to have this efficient, agile system that can respond to any crisis around the world. Finally, the world today is again dealing with a massive crisis and unprecedented humanitarian need, as you have already heard, and you have the conflicts that are ongoing, the intrastate conflicts in Syria and Yemen. You have mass migration and displacement and forced migration and displacement in terms of the immigration and the refugee crisis across the world, including the Rohingyas and migration from Africa. You have political instability in parts of Asia and Latin America, and on top of that, you have seismic political changes that are going on in the form of Brexit, conflicts brewing in South Asia between China and India, etc. And of course, at the moment, the world is in the grips of the coronavirus. This is a pandemic. It has been compared with the influenza in the early periods. However, it is not something that the world is prepared for. So we really are in an unprecedented time at the moment. However, now that you have gone through the entire gamut of humanitarian evolution, you can probably trace the similarities and the differences, and look and really take a step back and analyze the contemporary humanitarian responses with what the humanitarian actors did before. And this is one of the major purposes of this lecture, is to give you this context that even though we have conflicts, mass migration, pandemics, etc., it is not something that is unique to this period or that is new to this period. The world has gone through these kind of crises before in one form or another, and humanitarians have responded to the best of their ability. Most importantly, the spirit of humanitarianism is the one that matters, and that is at the core, and that remains constant throughout 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 the course of history. Of course, this doesn't mean that we get complacent. The humanitarian sector at the moment uh, is working on developing much more effective tools, and you've heard about the grand bargain, you've heard about methods like localization, subsidiarity, etc., which emerged out of the World Humanitarian Summit. Now, how they can be implemented, whether they will be implemented or not, this remain whether is the burden of history so much that the power dimensions cannot shift, or is this going to be the perfect storm that leads to a change in the power dynamics within the humanitarian sector? So these are questions that need to be seen, that remain to be seen, and these are the questions that you will be discussing with our panel of experts in the upcoming days. As a final point on this lecture, I would invite you to take a look at this synopsis. This is published by, this report is called the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, so, or the GHA 2020, and you also have UN OCHA's Humanitarian Overview. These are two reports that you should be mindful of, and that you should be aware of, because they provide a very good overview of the humanitarian sector and the key trends. Finally, to recap a few key points. First of all, humanitarianism is universal and timeless. So, humanitarianism, nobody has a monopoly over humanitarian action. The global humanitarian system, in some ways, has come a full circle, I would argue. It started off as individual acts of um, individual acts of compassion and rescue, and when we look at Henri Dunant's initiative, how he gathered the local nurses in the local villages and tried to provide humanitarian assistance, we see a similar a call for going back to the basics, going back to the key humanitarian, the core humanitarian principles, and also you see major organizations and leaders within the humanitarian sector talking about some of the core values such as building trust, empowerment, participation, etc. So in some ways, there is, while the humanitarian system today is a multi-billion dollar exercise involving thousands and thousands of people, there is a call from within the sector to go back to the basics, to go back to its mandate and be true to itself, while acknowledging that there are other actors who operate within the humanitarian context who may not be humanitarians themselves. So these include the private sector, the peace building actors, the development actors, etc. So a refreshing feature of this era is that rather than trying to be an exclusive entity, humanitarian actors are trying, for the first time, in my opinion, trying to define their role vis-a-vis all these other actors that occupy the humanitarian space. The third thing to recap is, as we have seen, is that the mission of international humanitarian action to have this efficient international infrastructure that is agile and able to respond to any crisis around the world, that remains unchallenged. However, its delivery is problematic because of the shortcomings, because of the lack of resources, and the fact that the humanitarian sector is overstretched, and also because at different points in time, whether it was the 50s, the 70s, the 80s, during the Cold War period, the 90s, or even now, there is a very visible and prominent neo-colonial ring to the way aid is delivered. And this is one of the reasons why there is so much mistrust within the different actors in humanitarian action. So the delivery part of humanitarian action is really something that still needs work. And finally, the whole challenge of how to mobilize humanitarian resources, because we are at a time of unprecedented need, and now with the pandemic and the ensuing recession, there already is, and there is going to be a reduction in the availability of humanitarian aid. So those are the key points, those are the key takeaways. Thank you very much for joining me on this really long lecture. I hope you can listen to this in part, and hope you have the time sometime in the future to look at the additional videos and resources that I've mentioned. If you have any questions or queries, please don't hesitate to write to me. Thank you very much.